Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATVMC. Today I'm going to show you how to disassemble a RZR XP 1000 engine. You're watching part 2 of our engine rebuilding series. Now in part 1 we mentioned doing a cylinder leak down test, and what we found on this, we had 23% leak down on one cylinder, 21% leak down on the other, and the spec is actually 15% leak down max. So we knew we're due for a top end. We actually, to get the top end rebuilt, we have to tear down the complete motor. So that's what we're going to show you how to do today. And if you're not to this point yet, go back and watch part 1. We show you how to remove the engine from the machine. And once we did that, we went ahead and washed everything up. So we're ready to start disassembly. To do this job, we have our SLP heavy duty flywheel puller. We have a strap wrench to hold the flywheel and a smaller strap wrench for our oil filter. We also have some safety wire, common hand tools, feeler gauges. We have this piston pin puller from Motion Pro, rags, safety glasses, rubber gloves, some waterproof grease. We'll also need a cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate. And don't forget your pen and paper to write things down, and you'll also want some Ziploc bags and a Sharpie to make sure everything's labeled and organized. Now always refer to your model specific service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. All right, first thing we're going to do is remove our spark plugs, and then after that we'll remove the valve cover. We have 4 T40 Torx bits on top. We'll remove those, and again, it's really important to stay organized throughout the process. So any bolts we're taking off, we're putting in a Ziploc bag, and we're going to label those bolts. All right, now that we have the valve cover removed, we're going to check our valve clearances, and that way when we disassemble everything, if we don't need to cut our valve seats or replace our valves, then we know if any of the valves are out of adjustment, what shim we'll be putting back in. That way we don't have to double do any work. So to check these valve clearances, what we need to do is be able to rotate the engine over. And to do that, we're going to remove our stator cover, and that way we can just use the flywheel and turn this engine over where we need it. And to pull this cover off, I'm just going to move the wiring out of the way so we don't get hung up. And then keep in mind that this is magnetized, so it might be a little bit hard to pull off. Now this engine has 8 valves on it, and to check each valve, what you're going to do is make sure that the cam lobe for that valve is facing straight up, and then we'll take our feeler gauge, we'll insert it in there and measure that clearance and write it down. So as you can see, these cam lobes are not vertical right now, so this is the next one we're going to check. So we'll rotate our engine clockwise from the flywheel side, and when we do that, that's going to bring these cam lobes facing straight up, and that will allow us to use our feeler gauge. And then we'll do the same steps for the other valves. Make sure you write those measurements down, and if you're not familiar with valve adjustments on these Polaris RZR motors, we do have a video specifically for that. They are a little bit different since the bucket actually has the shim built into it. So be sure to check that out if you're not familiar with this style of engine. Now that we have our valve clearances measured and written down, we need to get the PTO cylinder on top dead center on the compression stroke, and that cylinder is the one that's closest to the clutch. So to do that, we're going to go down to the flywheel. We'll rotate this clockwise. We'll keep rotating this until these 2 lines on the intake cam, both eyes are facing up, and then on the exhaust cam sprocket, the 2 lines are flush with the cylinder head with the E's facing up so you can read them. So once those marks are lined up and you've checked that this line on the flywheel is also lined up with this rib on the side of the case, then you know you're at top dead center compression on the PTO cylinder. Now that we're at top dead center, we're going to remove our cam chain tensioner. This one's an aftermarket one from Tusk. And the reason we're using this, it eliminates a lot of the problems that these OEM cam chain tensioners are notorious for. This is a hydraulic style. This one's mechanical, and you're not going to have the same failures as this hydraulic style. So to remove the OEM one, it's just going to sit flush against your case, and you'll loosen this bolt up and just remove it. This aftermarket style, we're going to loosen these 3 bolts. That's going to help us with reassembly, and then we'll remove it the same way as the OEM one. Now, as you can see, our engine rotated just a little bit, and that's just because these camshafts are under a little bit of tension from the valve springs. So don't worry about that, that's normal. Now that we have top dead center compression on the PTO side, what we're going to do is rotate this flywheel 360 degrees. All right, once you've gone 360 degrees, you want to make sure that this timing mark still lines up. What turning our crankshaft 360 degrees did is turn our cams 180 degrees. So what we'll do now is remove these 2 bolts in our cam sprockets. Once these bolts are removed, we can rotate the crankshaft another 360 degrees. That'll put us back on top dead center on the PTO cylinder. And again, you'll make sure that this timing mark lines up. And again, we'll verify that we're on top dead center compression stroke on the PTO side by checking the marks on the cam sprockets. Next, we'll remove this upper cam chain guide and the camshaft carrier on this outside. So we've got 4 bolts on top we're going to be removing. And these 2 outer bolts I'm going to use to help remove this camshaft carrier and just have something to grab onto. Now that we've done that, I'm going to cut just a little bit of safety wire, and we're going to attach this to our cam chain so we don't drop it into the bottom end yet. I'm just going to make a hook on the end. Once we have that there, we'll remove the remaining 2 cam sprocket bolts. And to help get these off, we're going to use a 21 millimeter wrench on the camshaft. Then we'll remove the cam sprockets. And when you take all these valve train components off, make sure you lay them out in order. We want to put them in the same orientation they were before, because all these parts wear together. Now, before we remove these cam caps, what we're going to do is take any pressure off of the camshafts. So this one, I'm going to rotate the cam just a little bit until there's no pressure on it. This other one doesn't have any pressure. Then we're going to remove the bolts for the cam caps in a crisscross pattern. As I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you lay all these parts out in order. This exhaust camshaft is different than the intake. And when you're taking everything off, you want to make sure you locate these 4 dowel pins and make sure you don't drop any of them down into the motor. Now that we have the camshafts removed, we're going to remove the valve tappets. Keep in mind, you want to keep these in order. They're all numbered, and that number correlates to the shim that's built into them. And it's kind of hard to see, but that number is just lasered right into the bottom of that shim. And to pull these out, it just makes it a lot easier to use a magnet. The next thing we need to do is remove the parts that are attached to the cylinder head and the cylinder. So I'm going to start with these intake boots. We'll take those off. If it looks like these boots aren't sealing well, make sure you get them replaced. And then after that, we'll move on to the thermostat housing. So I'm going to disconnect this hose from it. Then I'm going to crack these 2 bolts loose that are on the top, and I'll just back them out far enough that I don't forget about them. We're going to want to inspect that thermostat, and then we'll unbolt this housing from the cylinder head. Next thing we need to do is remove this oil filter, so I'm going to place a rag underneath it. And I'll take my oil filter wrench and remove it. After that, we'll remove these 2 oil cooler lines and then this water hose coming to this elbow. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the water pump assembly. So to remove it, we have the 3 gold colored bolts. Those are the ones that attach it to the motor. But I'm also going to loosen the 3 other bolts, and that way I can have this cover loose, and that's going to help us later on with reassembly. Now that we have the bolts removed, we can remove the water pump, and these things, the O-rings, can get kind of cooked on there, so you might have to work it out just a little bit at a time. After that, we can remove our cooling elbow. Next, we'll remove the oil cooler by removing the 4 Allen key bolts. Then we'll remove the 2 O-rings. Next, we'll remove this elbow that our crankcase breather hose was attached to, and I'm just going to remove our dipstick just to get this out of the way. And if you had a leak by this fitting, you can take this tube off and replace that O-ring. Ours is fine, so we're just going to remove the whole assembly. The next thing we're going to do is remove the cylinder head. We have 8 bolts in it. The first 2 that we need to remove are these 2 8mm head bolts on the side. Once those are gone, we can remove the 6 cylinder head bolts on top. And when you remove these, it might be good to have someone help stabilize the motor while you break them loose. And when you break these bigger bolts loose, we're just going to do about 1/8 of a turn on each one, maybe 1/4 of a turn. And once they're all loose, then we can back them all the way out. Now these 6 bigger bolts are a little bit harder to see, so we tip the engine sideways, and that way you can get a better view. And we'll just use a magnet to remove all of these bolts. Now that we have the hardware removed from the cylinder head, we need to break it free from the cylinder. So we're going to use a mallet to lightly tap on it, and you just want to tap on any supported areas and just don't hit too hard. You don't want to damage this. We'll let our cam chain drop down, and we'll remove the cylinder head gasket. Next, we're going to install the cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate on top of the cylinder, and once we get to the point where we flip the engine over, it just keeps the cylinder from falling off. And these bolts just need to be finger tight. Now back to the side of the motor, we're going to remove the starter torque limit gear. And I'm just going to pull on that shaft. It's going to release it. The next thing we need to do is remove this flywheel mounting bolt. We're going to use a strap wrench and breaker bar to do that. And something to keep in mind, when you're breaking this loose, you don't want to turn the engine over because that's going to bind up your cam chain and you don't want to damage that. The next thing we'll do is take our flywheel puller, and we've already greased the threads, and this piece that mounts to the flywheel, it's actually reverse thread. So we'll go counterclockwise to tighten it on, and we'll go all the way until it bottoms out by hand. Now once that's bottomed out, we can tighten down the center bolt. We'll hold this piece with a wrench, and then it's going to pop our flywheel off. Once it's broken free, we'll pull the flywheel off. Now keep in mind on the back side, you want to keep a hand on this gear. This is your one-way clutch, and you want to make sure it doesn't fall off. Next, we need to remove our woodruff key so we don't lose it. So I'm just going to tap on one end with a punch and raise it up. And then I'm going to tap it the rest of the way out. Okay, now we're going to remove these cam chain tensioners. So we've got a T40 Torx bit on that one, and then 6mm Allen key on the other. And at this point, I'm going to remove our safety wire from the cam chain. All right, now we're ready to flip this motor over. Now it's time to remove this oil pan. So to do that, we have 3 larger bolts that are a 13mm head, and the rest of the bolts have an 8mm head. Once the bolts are removed, we'll tap on the oil cover and remove it from the engine. Ours is stuck on here pretty good, and you might have the same thing going on. So right here we have a pry tab, and we're just going to pry up on that a little bit to break it free. Now we're going to remove the oil pickup screen. We have 1 bolt right here we need to remove, and then it's just going to pull out. Now that that's out of the way, we can access all of the bolts for the oil pump. So I'm going to remove all the bolts, and then there's actually 2 pins. We need to use a magnet, pull those pins out, and then we can free the oil pump from this chain and remove it. So for this one here, we've got to bring in the heavy hitter. It's going to get that pulled up. All right, this O-ring right here stayed behind from the oil pump. So you definitely want to make sure you locate that and remove it. Now at this point, we're going to flip our motor back over. Now with the motor right side up, we're going to remove these 2 bigger bolts that hold the case halves together. And then there's 11 smaller bolts all the way around the case halves. And we'll just loosen those up in a crisscross pattern and remove them. All right, now that we have all these bolts out of the upper case half, we're going to flip the motor back over. On the bottom side of the motor, we've got 1 bolt right here. We're going to remove that, and these 2 bolts right here. And for this bolt right here, I had to use a 1/4" drive 13mm socket just because the 3/8 wouldn't fit down in there. There's just not enough clearance. These next 8 bolts that we're going to remove, we're actually going to be replacing. And same thing goes for the cylinder head bolts and the connecting rod cap bolts. All right, so we have all the bolts out of this crankcase half, but the other thing we need to do is make sure the gasket isn't going to hold it together where the seam is. So I'm going to rip that off on both sides. And then we can take our soft face mallet and we'll tap on the crankcase and work it off from the other half. All right, next thing we need to do is remove this balancer shaft. I do want to point out on the balancer shaft there's timing marks. So we've got that white dot right there. Yours may or may not have that. And then we have another dot right here on the other side. That white dot is just some paint that's covering the other stamped dot. And how we're going to remove this is we're just going to rotate it out of place. After that, we're going to remove these rod caps. So I just rotated the crank so we can access both of them pretty easy. So what I want to point out here is these rod caps match the connecting rod and they go in a specific order. So you want to pay attention to that, and they're actually stamped. So let me pull these off and I'll show you. All right, so this one here, this has a 667. Same with the connecting rod, it has that same number stamped into that side. On the other side, this one has a 2, and this is going to be a sizing indicator. So we'll talk more about that on our cleaning and inspection video. Now we'll remove the other connecting rod cap. All right, our next step is to remove the crankshaft. So when we do that, we're also going to pull this oil seal off and remove both chains. All right, next thing we're going to do is remove these plain bearings, and it's a good idea to keep these in order to know what they were because they have color codings on them, and that way when we take our measurements you can just verify that you're putting the correct parts back in. So this one's a green bearing, so I would recommend writing that down and which connecting rod it came out of, and then it's the same thing for the crankshaft bearings. So this one's pretty hard to see. It looks like a light blue. And then these counterbalancer bearings, you're not going to have color codes on these. They just are all the same size. And once you have all of these plain bearings out of this case half, make sure you get all of the matching bearings out of the other case half. Once you've done that, there's this plastic guide right here. We'll remove that, and then we're going to flip this engine over so it's right side up again. Next, we'll remove our cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate. We'll pull these cylinders off the case half, and once it's on the bench, then we'll remove the pistons. Next, we'll take this case half and we'll remove it from our engine stand and put it on the bench as well, and we'll get everything cleaned up and ready for inspection. All right, before we remove the pistons from the cylinder, I want to talk about these serial numbers on the connecting rods. So you can see we have a matching serial number for the cap and the rod, and the serial number is facing where we had that cooling elbow on the cylinder. We want to put these in the same positions and facing the same direction as when we took them off. So just keep those things in mind. Now moving on to the second piston and connecting rod. This one is 544. So once we've written that down, we'll go ahead and remove this from the cylinder. Next, we need to remove our connecting rod from the piston. So to do that, we're going to remove this circlip. We'll pull the wrist pin and then remove the connecting rod. So this wrist pin doesn't want to slide out very easy, so we're going to use the piston pin puller from Motion Pro, and we're going to get the correct adapter. So this one has the notch in it, and we're going to put the round side facing up. Slide the tool all the way through, and this side right here is the side that we removed the circlip from. And then we'll install this collar. This is reverse thread. And then we'll tighten the tool down and pull that wrist pin through. And then we'll do the same thing for the other connecting rod. And that's how you tear down your XP1000 engine. If you need any parts for your machine, be sure to check out our website. We offer free shipping on orders over $75, and we have a lot of different options on there. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's where you'll find part 3 of our engine rebuilding series, where we show you how to measure, clean, and inspect all of these parts. Thanks for watching.